the privilege of having a live audience, we could make this a little bit more on the interactive side. Let's see here. Let me just bring up. Where is the full screen option?
Oh, right here.
Is that one?
Mm-hmm.
That one here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you. So this is one of my favorite topics, but it's also in my mind the hardest. And the reason it's the hardest is because I don't believe, I'm not that unicorn that believes that there's any magic pill or formula that's going to make us feel magically fulfilled, magically resilient, especially when we've gone through a difficult time or are going through a difficult time. That said, I do think that there is wisdom that we can draw from that can make a meaningful difference. And I know we only have a few minutes. I'm going to try to share a few of those high-level ideas, and hopefully we can kind of talk this through as a group. If you look at the medical literature, thankfully over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been more recognition of at least describing what suffering can mean for an individual, right? 50 years ago, 40 years ago, when I was in med school, there wasn't as much attention to this dimension of our health, but this is very personal for us, right? If we're not addressing this aspect of our humanity, it doesn't matter what the scan shows on some level if we're still struggling with any of these boxes. And how some in the medical world describe this. So it could be preoccupation with the future of the past, which, right? And this is, by the way, not specific to the oncology arena, right? These are life issues that we all have to contend with at some time. Feeling disconnected from ourselves, from our others, our family members, our community, feeling like we want or need to be in control, but we're not, or at least that's how we might feel at times. Or as we'll talk about this, an existential vacuum, a vacuum in our sense of meaning and purpose in life. So I'm going to draw on some of the themes that we kind of worked through together in our GRACE program to try to address some of these concerns. And when we start the program, actually start by asking these questions, because at the end of the day, again, and please feel free to interrupt me if you want to challenge my assumptions. What we're really hoping for is not just a medical report that gives us a thumbs up, but it's a sense of being healthy, or a feeling of being resilient, or probably most importantly, we all want to feel like we're living a life of fulfillment. Now, if you look up the word medicine, it's from the Latin medicina, which means to heal or to restore health. Now, if I asked you, and maybe you could humor me, when you hear the word medicine today, what do most of us think of? There's no wrong answer. What do you think of reflexively? I wouldn't overthink this.
Pills.
Okay, so somebody here said pills. Thank you. What else? Do they hear the audio?
Only you hear that.
I'll repeat. Okay, so pills. Anyone else, either in person or virtual?
Illness.
So somebody in the room said doctor. Somebody on the audio said illness. Okay. Something to help cure. And at least based on my experience, many along the lines of what you said, most of us think of a pill or a surgery or a procedure, a blood test, right? Something that the doctor prescribes or gives to you. And what's the challenge with that? And I believe, and maybe you'll agree, that the challenge with this is we're in a reactionary state, right? You're not really in control of what the surgeon does. You may choose your surgeon if you're lucky. You can't really control what the CAT scan shows, but you'll do your best on your part, but you can't control what the tumor marker level is going to be. You're in a state of reaction, which again goes back to one of the elements of suffering, right? Which is we don't feel like we really have control. And if we go back to these basic questions again. What does it mean to be healthy, to be resilient, to be fulfilled? There is no medicine that will answer these fundamental questions of what it means to live. I prescribe antidepressants, and I do feel like they play an important role for some people. I prescribe Xanax and Ativan and anti-anxiety medicines when the situation I think is appropriate. They in isolation will not answer these basic questions of, right, of the art of living. And so, right, there is no magic pill. And that's why, again, this is a difficult conversation. And one of the things that we work through together in the program, and again, right now it's just a sentence thrown at you, but the hypothesis being that perhaps healing in the most holistic way will really be determined by the types of thoughts that we think about on a consistent basis and the disciplined behaviors and actions that we engage in on a daily and consistent basis. And for the next few minutes, I want to just give you a very, very high level, and I don't mean to be superficial about this, but just because of time, we'll just give like a global sense of what some of those ingredients might be, just based on, you know, my experience, but really the experience of many, many, many wise people I think we've drawn from. So some of you may have heard of this gentleman. He got a fair amount of attention. Oh, it's been, I can't believe it, like 6-7 years now. This is a picture of Mr. Israel Crystal. And he got a fair amount of recognition because in 2016, he earned the Guinness Book of World Record for being the oldest male alive at the time. He was 112. Actually passed away 1 year later at 113. So certainly that was a remarkable feat, but the reason he really got a fair amount of attention was not only was he a male at 112 at the time, but he was also a Holocaust survivor. He whittled down to something like 89 pounds. He's a pretty tall guy. He lost everyone in his family. He lost all of his personal belongings. I mean, everything was taken away from him, right? So I think we could all agree he suffered, right? He suffered tremendous losses during that time. And of course, he was subjected to all these interviews when he got this Guinness record. And of course, everyone asked him one question, right? Among others, but the key question was, how in the world did he go through all this and still make it to 112? And I just pulled one passage from one interview that at least spoke to me, and I'll read you what he said. So he said, "I don't know the secret for long life. I believe that everything is determined from above, and we shall never know the reasons why. There have been smarter, stronger, and better looking men than me who are no longer alive. All that is left for us to do is to keep on working as hard as we can and rebuild what is lost." Now, I'll be the first to admit I have no idea how he made it to 112, later 113. And I'm sure genes and sheer luck played a major role. But if I had to guess, maybe if you had to guess, that last sentence may have offered us some clue, right? And he alluded to this idea that he had to rework as hard as he can and rebuild what is lost, which to me is indicating he had some clear idea of what his sense of meaning and purpose was in his life. It was a difficult life, right? And I don't think, would he ever say it was worth it to go through the Holocaust to achieve what he learned? Of course not. But I think the idea is even things that are not worth it, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily worthless. And there's something that we can try to glean from even a horrible situation as what he endured. And of course, this has been talked about in others in a different respect. Many of you, I hope, are familiar with the work of Dr. Viktor Frankl. He also was a Holocaust survivor. He was in 4 different concentration camps. And I'm not here to retell the stories, but he also lost tremendously. Everyone in his life perished. Right? He also was subjected to all the infectious diseases, hunger, sleep deprivation, incredibly difficult work losses, and even his academic work, right? They took the manuscripts away from him, which was very important to his sense of in at least academic pursuits. So he suffered, and he kind of, as a young psychiatrist, when he was absorbed in the camps, he anecdotally observed, let's say 1 in 10 people survived the concentration camps. Again, he admitted a lot of that was just luck, right? Just what line you were directed to, and maybe other factors that were really quite random. But he argued that it was more than just luck. And with his clinical eye, he kind of observed, you know what, these 1 in 10, despite everything they're going through, they have something to live for. Whether it was to get back to their art, or to teach, or to write a book about what happened, or to try to reunite with a loved one that they hope is still alive, they all had something to keep them living. He argued and he observed that those who lost all hope, they were the first to succumb to hunger, to lack of food, to lack of sleep, to infectious illnesses. And so his basic argument in Man's Search for Meaning was that it's that sense of purpose or meaning that sustains us when times are difficult. And he argued that there are basically 3 fundamental sources. And one can pursue meaning in any one of these arenas, or a combination of them, through our work. And this could be, you know, your career, your employment, or something you do on a volunteer basis, through acts of love or caring for another human being, or mustering a sense of courage, right? Cultivating a sense of courage when we are going through challenge and difficult times. So keep in mind, he wrote the manuscript for Man's Search for Meaning, I think, in 9 days in its original language. 9 days he put it together. In 1946, I believe. The English translation came out, I think, in the early 1950s of Man's Search for Meaning. Not too long ago, there was a fairly substantial medical publication. And what they basically did was they kind of grouped together as a meta-analysis. So they grouped together 10 studies. And so they had 130,000 plus individuals in the study. And they had information on what was already known for longevity, associations for longevity. They knew who smoked. They knew who had diabetes, who was obese, who exercised and who didn't, who had other medical illnesses that are known to be associated with generally how long humans live. And in a statistically valid way, they kind of accounted for all these variables, but they had an interesting question. They wanted to compare the individuals who had the most sense of meaning or purpose in their life versus those that had the least. And what they found, you see the numbers before you, those that had the strongest sense of purpose, even accounting for all the variables that we just talked about, had a 17% lower risk in mortality, overall mortality, and even cardiovascular disease. So of course, heart attacks and strokes also was reduced by 17%. Now I want to emphasize, this number didn't go to 0. So I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this, that all we have to do is have a great purpose in life and magically everything gets cured. People in the Holocaust died even if they had a tremendous sense of purpose. So it's not perfect, but it's also not nothing, right? These are still very large numbers in the scheme of things. And perhaps more importantly, and I'm going to make this case more in the next few minutes, this is something we still have control over, right? The way we live our life, how we view our daily activities with this lens or not, is still something that we have some sense of control. One of the things that Frankl did and beckons his readers to do is to stop asking the question, what do I expect from life? And instead, he asked his readers to ask, what does life expect from me? Now, I know it's just a simple transposition of words, but if you just reflect on it for a moment, you could imagine, if you ask yourself these 2 questions, the way we go about engaging in our daily lives with the mindset of what do I expect from life, is quite different from that of what does life expect from me. And Frankl, again, in his book, and if you haven't read it, I think it's only 120 pages, but it's really worth the read. One of the things he comes to over and over again is this sense of responsibility, right? That we all have a task. Sometimes the task that is before us, right, is not easy, but his argument is we have a responsibility to see how we respond to that task before us. Now, keep in mind, again, Frankl's book, again, came out in the 40s and then the 1950s. There was a relatively recent study, and this was actually led by Steve Cole at UCLA, who I've actually been in contact with recently. He's an amazing researcher. And he did something interesting. They basically took a group of adults who all reported high levels of well-being. So if you ask them, what's your quality of life like? They said they're happy, okay? But then they divided them into two groups, and the two groups were, basically half the group was classified as hedonistic, and I think we all know what's a hedonist, of course. Just want to make sure, I know it's afternoon, we're awake, what? Pleasure seekers, right? Generally, like if I'm at a dinner party, and if I knew the person sitting to my left is strongly hedonistic, I might assume that he or she came because they knew filet mignon was going to be served, with nice wine, and everyone's dressed up nice, and champagne, and they were drawn to these elements of the event. Now, what if I knew the person on my other side was very eudaimonic? I imagine it's a term many of us have not heard. Anybody that doesn't already know, anybody want to venture a guess? What is a eudaimonic person? It's a term from Aristotle. Anybody on the video side want to take a guess?
Communal?
So yes, I think it's on the right track. So Aristotle referred to this as someone who is living a virtuous life. So it's one associated more with the idea of service, more about giving back, meaning, purpose, etc. Basically that's what, on some level, what it alludes to. Now, again, they had adults who all said they were happy. Some of them were on the eudaimonic spectrum, someone were on the hedonistic spectrum. Then they did something interesting. They wanted to analyze their inner biology, right? And I know it's a busy slide. Hang in there. I'm going to walk you through this. So what did they do? They analyzed their blood. And the first thing on part A of the graph, they looked at something called CTRA gene expression. Now, as just a 2-second primer, I think we all know by this point that even though we inherit our genes from mom and dad, which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off may be regulated to a meaningful degree by how we live our life, our environment, our exposures, our toxins, and the way that we go about our living. And the first part they notice is that the hedonistic group, what you'll notice, upregulated, right? In part A, we'll see if the mouse is moving, right? They upregulated the CTRA gene expression, the eudaimonic group downregulated. Now, what is the CTRA gene? It's the gene that's associated with adversity and this fight or flight response, right? So if I'm constantly wandering the jungle by myself without a tribe, and I feel like I have to watch out for predators all the time, I can tell you my CTRA gene is going to be upregulated because I need that system of the stress hormones being upregulated so I can manage, right, the environment in which I'm in. Probably a good thing if I'm in that situation, may not be a good thing if I'm looking at my long-term health in a stable, otherwise, non-threatening environment. Now, part B, if you could draw your attention there, you'll notice the hedonist group had higher levels of inflammation. And I'm sure most of us have recognized, right, that chronic inflammation is associated with most of our chronic health issues, heart disease, diabetes, dementia, et cetera, some cancers. And you notice they had lower levels of antibodies. And the eudaimonic group was essentially the reverse. You could see they had lower levels of inflammatory markers and substantially higher levels of antibodies, which we need for our immune systems, right? Our immune systems are not working well if our antibodies are suppressed. Now, remember, Frankel's argument 70 years prior was, he said, the people that had a sense of meaning in what they were going through, they just somehow seemed a little bit less vulnerable to the infectious outbreaks that would commonly occur in the camps. And we could only imagine in my mind how he would feel if he were alive, in 2016, to give some biological credibility to what he observed, again, as a young psychiatrist 70 years earlier. So in a sense, and again, this is my interpretation, the hedonistic person is the kind of person that may go about asking, what do I expect from life? And the eudaimonic, what does life expect from me? I will also go on and say, I think it's probably works fine to be on the hedonistic spectrum. We go about our lives, and I think it works out just fine most of the time until something really tragic and difficult happens. Then I think it's not going to provide us the outlook that's going to allow us to make sense of this. Because what do I expect from life? I don't want cancer or heart disease or an amputation or a spinal cord injury. Who would? That outlook just, in my mind, and feel free to challenge me, just will not allow us to grapple in a way that is going to allow us to rise above those challenges. Now, if there are any, I don't know if there's any science people, but there was an issue with, if there was, let me go back a slide. There we go. There's an issue that, somebody that is going to be critical with this study. And the argument is, well, maybe the hedonistic group had more inflammation because they were having more Pepsi and potato chips, right? And because they're, and they just sit on the couch all day. And that's why their inflammation level's up, right? It's like reverse causation. It's not the hedonism that caused this, it's their lifestyle that caused what you see here, which is a perfectly valid argument, okay? Then Steve Cole and his group more recently did another study. This one, when you do a randomized clinical trial, if you've heard about study design, that accounts for all of these unknown biases and variables. And so in this one, this was very elegantly done. They took 160 women in the Southern California area, and they measured their CTRA gene expression. And after they did that at baseline, they randomized them. So randomly, they had them go into one of four groups. You were either asked to be kind to the world, kind to yourself, kind to others, or control. You were asked not to change anything. So this was their basic study. So they measured CTRA gene expression, then for just 5 weeks. And I want to highlight that piece, right? It wasn't 5 years or 5 months even. Just for 5 weeks, they asked these adults to live under one of those four life outlooks. And just to kind of go through it very briefly. So kindness to others group, and I'm just highlighting some key part of the instructions. They were told, tomorrow you're going to perform 3 nice things for others. So one person wrote, I made my significant other their favorite meal. Some other person wrote, they raked their leaves for their neighbor or whatever it may be. So it was just a simple act. For the kindness to the world group, they were instructed, tomorrow you're going to do 3 nice things to improve the world. One person said they donated money to Plant Discovery Day. The third group, there's a lot of attention on self-care, right? They asked these individuals to do 3 acts of kindness for yourself. Right? One person went to the beach. One person left work early and had a Thai coffee. Somebody else went to splurge on a massage, I think. And they had an account of this for 5 weeks. And again, the fourth group, to control, go about your day, keep track of your activities, but don't change your normal routines. Okay, so let's take an informal poll. Anybody want to venture a guess on who had the meaningful change in CTRA gene expression? It's kind. Now, keep in mind, I'm at an institution, some of you work in institutions, there is a lot of emphasis on, and I'm not discounting the importance of this, on self-care, right? Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Make sure, you do something nice for yourself. The only group that showed, you see the impact, the only group that had a measurable change in just 5 weeks was the acts of kindness for others. I'm not discounting the value of donating. Now, why not the acts of kindness for the world, like donating, which I think is very important to support your CSC. But why didn't they find a difference there? It was anonymous, right? They didn't get that human intercon. Maybe here, if you donate here, you'll get a hug from someone. That will do it. But just blindly going online and donating, it's probably important on a societal level, but it won't on a biological level. It doesn't have the same impact, at least from what we can tell on a study like this. Yes.
What is CTI?
So it's the gene that's turned on and off for the adversity response, the stress, the fight or flight response. That and again, you actually can show in 6 weeks that you can upregulate or downregulate our genes with how you're living your life. But to me, the beauty of this is it shows that it's not set in stone, right? So that was. And if there's nothing you take away from that piece, it was that basic. And by the way, even though Frankl said, stop asking yourself, what do I expect for your life? But what does life expect from me? If some choose to, change that to, what does God expect from me, or whatever word makes sense to you is what I would use. Okay, so let me go to a second theme now, which is again another difficult challenge, but it's the art of learning to master perspective. I'm going to quote Sean Aker. He said only 10% of your long-term happiness is based on the external world, while 90% is based on how your brain processes the world. So that's, I think, an introduction to remind us that, again, being a Pollyanna about life is not going to solve, I think, our challenges in the long run either, right? So there's an authentic way in which we can manage how we see our world that, again, isn't making you a Pollyanna, but still allows you to have authentic hope. And the question is, well, again, how do you do that? Again, Frankl offers us some insight. His answer was, again, you control your attitude, which is not easy, but this was an incredible passage. He said, we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken away from man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So Frankl, I think, really came to this idea over and over again that nothing can take away how we're going to respond, which is again our attitude. And it's really, he didn't use these words. It is in a sense the art of cognitive behavioral therapy. There's another quote based on Frankl's work, but I think it really speaks to the art of CBT. Just between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. So there's a situation, right? I'm stuck in traffic. And when you're stuck in traffic, how do we all feel? We feel like irritated, frustrated, annoyed, right? But there's usually a thought that led to that feeling that we don't even capture because it just happens so quickly. What Frankl is arguing is, right, if we can learn to pause and figure out what that thought is so we can change it. That is what CBT is. Then we can maybe have a more empowering response. And again, this is another quote from him that alludes to the same idea. Again, this stuff is not easy, but I think it's what he asks of us. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves. So again, this little piece is about how do we master perspective, which is not an easy skill. I've more recently been more and more interested in the idea of legacy as a way to learn to have a sense of perspective. And again, most of us, and this was certainly me. I mean, when you're younger, you're thinking about how do you invest your money, how do you invest your finances, but not really do we often pay attention to how we invest our time, which is probably our most important commodity. And the challenge is, and this is from all the, right, it's coming from all the leadership books, right? If we are not paying attention to the things that matter the most, right? There's a whole economy that's trying to grab your attention, right? I mean, this is where you probably even saw the Surgeon General's warning this week about social media and loneliness and depression, anxiety among teens and suicidal ideation. I mean, these are quite serious concerns, but they grab your attention, right? We're always on this stuff. See our youth. And the challenge is if we're thinking about whatever is on Instagram, we're not really going to be dedicating much time, right, to the things that are really, really important. And, there's a beautiful psalm that, gives us some insight into this idea. And this is what the psalm says. And tell me what you think it means. It says, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom, which is the paradox, right? So I think what they're saying is if we realize that our days are numbered, that all of us are only here for a certain amount of time, then we're probably more likely not to let silly things, right, take our time and attention. I know we all as a society, we all want to live 150 years, we all want to live forever, but it's just all, we're all going to be mortal at some point. And I think it's this idea, which is the paradox, that if we remind ourselves, and I don't want to be morbid about this, nobody wants to think about death all the time, but if we don't think about it once in a while, then it's really hard to remind ourselves that we have a sense of urgency to do the things that really count, and not just, the urgent things that are kind of silly. And Maya Angelou had her own way of talking about this. And what I love about this quote is it reminds us that we're all creating a legacy. It's just whether we are going to be awareness, or we're going to have awareness of what our legacy is. Here's what she said. You have no idea what your legacy will be. Your legacy is what you do every day. Your legacy is every life you've touched, every person whose life was either moved or not. It's every person you've harmed or helped. That's your legacy. So we're all going to create one. It's just, are we going to focus to create the one that really we want? And that's what gives us, I think, another way of mastering, again, this challenging art of perspective, right? What really counts in the long run. Okay, I think the final idea I want to spend a couple moments on is thinking about, the science of gratitude. I think by this point, you've all heard this from in one way or another, that people who are generally more grateful have a number of health benefits. If you think about it, the last time you experienced a genuinely grateful moment, it was probably really hard to be thinking about yesterday or tomorrow or other things. At least in that moment, you were right there, right? And it's really hard to be having these other emotions, at least in that moment. People who are grateful sleep better, they have stronger immune systems, they're more likely to empathize, they have more social ties. But I mention it here because they also seem to be more resilient to stress and adversity. And if you're like me, I used to believe that when things line up perfectly, right? When you got the right report card, you got into the right school, you got the right job, you got whatever you wanted, then I'll be grateful. But what's the problem with that, right? It happens once every blue moon. And the people who really have mastered this art will actually argue the opposite, that it's not about thinking that life is perfect. And you'll see this with people. Some people have this ability to experience gratitude, not that you're grateful for, you know, having heart disease or spinal. I know there are people that say to me, oh, you know, cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, that's ludicrous. God bless the people that could feel that way, but it's still possible to experience gratitude if we believe these masters of living, even when things in life aren't going as we necessarily would want it to go. And there's no one who has, in my mind, been a teacher of this idea than David Ross. He's actually still alive. I think he's 96. He had an amazing TED Talk at the age of 84 that, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to see. But he really has this system for teaching others how we can experience the benefit and the magic of gratitude, again, without being a Pollyanna about things. And even when we're going through challenging times. Here's just one quote from one of his works. He said, "Does that mean that we can be grateful for everything? Certainly not. We cannot be grateful for violence, for war, for oppression, for exploitation. On the personal level, we cannot be grateful for the loss of a friend, for unfaithfulness, for bereavement. But I didn't say we can be grateful for everything. I said we can be grateful in every given moment." And that again is I think the secret, right, nuance that we all have to challenge ourselves to find. Okay, I know it's afternoon, so I'll pose this to the group again if you haven't heard me speak before. So what human condition increases the risk of death as much as smoking cigarettes and more than physical inactivity or obesity? Exactly. So I think finally, right, the Surgeon US Journal had a warning about this week, right? Finally. So this data actually goes back 10, 15 years. I think, you know, mainstream science is finally picking up on it. I'm gonna modify what you said. It's really chronic loneliness or isolation because, right, we all feel lonely sometimes. Right, a child moves away to college, we go through a separation, right? Things come up, but it's when that feeling is persistent month after month, year after year, maybe decade after decade, is when we're seeing these health challenges like heart issues, immune system issues, nervous system issues in the general population is associated with a 26% higher mortality rate. If you look at breast cancer survivors, again, there's some lack of clarity, but it seems to be associated with higher mortality rates for breast cancer. Then the question is, why? And by the way, this is not just an American issue, although I'm putting up some US numbers from 2018. 35 million Americans live alone today. 1960, only 13% of all households were living alone. But this is a Western society issue. The UK, you may be aware, and this is not just the pandemic, even before, around 2018, they developed a ministry of loneliness in the gut to contend with the epidemic that's going on in England and the United Kingdom. There was, I think, a very telling study from, it's been a little while, from 2006. It basically asked Americans at 2 time points, in 1985 and again 20 years later, around 2004, how many people do you think you can really confide in? And in 1985, 1 in 10 Americans said 0. 20 years later, the same survey, almost 1 in 4 said 0. This is before the pandemic, right? Before social media was invented. This is a more recent graph. Who Americans spend time with from Washington Post. Americans 15 and older are spending a lot more time alone than in 2013. And again, the trend started before the pandemic, but this is an when they say it's an epidemic, right? These are just incredible changes in how, especially, right, our youth are spending time compared to hanging out with friends, going places with friends, etc. So Now, keep in mind, this is where some of the controversy lies. You know, there's isolation and there's loneliness, and they're not necessarily the same thing, right? We all know people who are married and might feel deeply lonely, right? That we all know people that have lots of people around them and might feel very lonely. We all know people who live alone, but they feel connected to the neighbor or an aunt across town or somebody even across the country, and they don't feel lonely. So the loneliness literature is entirely subjective. It's just, again, it's how, the earlier quote from Sean Anker, it's how we perceive the world that seems to matter most, not just, you know, how many people around us. And again, I wouldn't bring up this topic if, again, if it's not something we couldn't control. And it's for some of us, I hope just hearing this, if we're in this bucket, it's a little bit more of an impetus to, you know, connect with the few people that mean the most to you, even though I realize, you know, it's a messy world and people are not talking to each other for all kinds of reasons. If we want to believe the science, I think the argument is it's worth the effort and the investment. Again, for some, you know, utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy with a therapist to see how we're, you know, viewing our relationships may be more meaningful. And again, this is another graph of the trends, right, over the last decade or two, where, again, whether it's patriotism, religion, having children, community involvement, all have or seem to be declining. Our interest in money is not. So again, how this is going to relate to like those things that we talked about, our inner biology or inflammatory state. That's the part that concerns me. So these are basic ideas that I've kind of pulled from what we call our GRACE program. That's 12 hours, and I don't know how long I was speaking for, but this is under an hour, so I know I'm just kind of scratching the surface. This is an overview of what we try to go into much more depth on for thinking about a whole variety of strategies for resilience. We're still, for now, doing it virtually. I don't know when we're going to go back in person. Partly it has to do with hospital policy. But if it's something that you may be interested in going through its entirety, you know, feel free to reach out to me. There's a quote that my colleague Jeffrey Wertheimer comes to over and over again that I think reminds us of how important habit is in all these strategies, whether it's connection or attitude or legacy or viewing the world through the lens of meaning. All of these things take practice. And this is a quote from Wilfred Peterson: as a single footstep will not make a path on the earth, so a single thought will not make a deep pathway in the mind. To make a deep physical path, we must walk and walk again. To make a deep mental path, we must think again and again the kind of thoughts we wish to have dominate our lives. So if I had to summarize on a very kind of high level, some things to consider for cultivating resiliency. It's what Frankl argued, right? Living a life of meaning and purpose, however you choose to define that. Mastering the art of how we see the world. And again, there's a way to do this without being a Pollyanna, but allows for a sense of authentic hope. The gratitude studies that have come out, I think, have been really compelling. When you do this for a while, and I believe me, I was cynical too. When you do this for a while, after 5 or 6 weeks, you'll automatically, just as you're going about your day, you'll just notice things, right? That you just wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And it's just those little moments that can really add up. Integrating a sense of legacy, and that's, again, the art of reminding ourselves of what's really important. Again, staying connected in our divided world as best as we can. I didn't talk about mindfulness today, but that clearly is one component. And Frankl actually talked about this humor in the middle of the concentration camp. In his words, he would invent a funny story he would tell, you know, his partners or his colleagues in the camps, right? So waiting for something funny to happen may not be the right way to go about it, because we'll be waiting forever sometimes. So he would, now we have all kinds of with, I like the New Yorker cartoons, there's YouTube comics, there's your sitcoms, whatever you like, to try to find a little bit of levity, right? Because it really becomes hard to grapple with all the seriousness, if not. Again, this was the first time I've had a chance to do this here in 3 years. So thank you for coming, both in person and virtually. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Jeffrey Wertheimer and Bronwyn Jones, who facilitate the program with me. And if there's a couple minutes, I'd love comments or things that rub you the wrong way. Of course.
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Asher or want to follow up on anything he said from here in the audience?
I think that might be a question.
Yeah, I
Go
do. This is Rebecca, and thank you for the great presentation. You said something, I didn't catch it, about if we're interested in going further to email you. What was that you were saying?
Okay, so the question was if somebody wanted to pursue the whole program, to feel free to email me. My email's on this slide, and we can get you the information about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's look at the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. So sorry, I didn't look earlier. Will the program be recorded? The answer, but answered yes. Okay. Will you please let us know the name of the book you're recommending? So there's so much incredible wisdom that I'm gleaning a lot of this from, but one that I referenced over and over again was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Let's see. Yeah, so it's Man's Search for Meaning. Somebody answered that. So somebody wrote, what if you actually did an action like plant a tree yourself to be kind to the world? And I did not mean to minimize the critical importance of that. And I'm sure, and also same for self-care. I don't mean to minimize the importance of that as well. But when I spoke to Steve Cole, who really led a lot of these studies at UCLA, it seems to be anything that's pro-social that seems to make that biologic change, which again, goes back to the connectivity piece, just feeling like we're part of a tribe or a community in some way. So I think we answered that one. Okay, I think we got them all. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I don't know if everyone can hear me, but I probably have to stay close to you. We're gonna wrap up. Listen here.
Thank you. It was excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Asher. We always love hearing you.
I'm hearing lots of thank
Okay,
yous
thank
and
you.
they're
you.
appreciating everything here. And then for those of you who registered, which is I think all of you, you'll be receiving an email with a copy of the recording. And so Becca will probably be reaching out to you. So thank you. I hope to see you again soon. Please go to our calendar and see what's coming up next.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye, everyone.
We love your
Thank you very much.
programs.
Thank you.